Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Savannah Harenque if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today, I am joined by Alabama Democratic Party leader and state rep Chris England. Now, Representative England is here today to talk about the recent developments in Alabama's redistricting case. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, the latest development is that the Supreme Court of the United States issued a ruling earlier this week overturning a lower court ruling that said Alabama needed to redraw its maps. I know that sounds confusing. We're going to break it down here in a minute with Representative England, but essentially what that means is the Supreme Court said the current maps are going to stand at least through this year's election. Now, the reason that's a big deal and the reason that the Alabama Democratic Party and Democrats across the country are unhappy about this is because it means only one of the state's 7 congressional districts is a Black district. Now, we know that Alabama's electorate is made up of about 27% of Black Alabamians. That means a little bit over 1 in 4 Alabamians identifies as a Black Alabamian, yet they only have one majority Black congressional district. Representative England, I know this is something that you are very upset about. I've seen your reaction on social media and other interviews, which you have said that this is just a devastating blow to voting rights across the country and to Alabama.
Yeah, it is. And first, thank you for having me. It's good to spend our lunch break together. And yes, you are correct. All across the country at this very moment. States, cities, counties are all going through their redistricting process. And many were waiting to see what direction this court case was going to go in before they decided to continue whatever they were doing. And many municipalities have shifting populations, growing minority populations that represent a large enough portion of the city or the county that they're in or the state that they're in where they deserve the opportunity to create districts that will allow them to elect people of their choosing. And as soon as that decision was rendered, that order stayed, the court order, I'm pretty sure you're going to start seeing people continue on that pathway of diluting the impact that minority voters, whether they be Hispanic or Black or whatever, have on the process overall. So, yeah. It's a big deal. And the larger issue to me also is the fact that Section 2 is really the only component of the Voting Rights Act that's left that has any teeth in it. And I know that both Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Roberts, in their opinions, mentioned that this was not on the merits. Justice Roberts made it very clear that it's time to make some decisions about what vote dilution in Section 2 actually means. And if history is any indicator of what direction we're going, he authored the opinion in Shelby that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So pardon me for being just a little nervous about where this is headed.
I'm glad that you keep mentioning that word, the dilution, because a big part of the claims here in the redistricting case is that Black voters and other minority voters across Alabama, that essentially their votes didn't matter as much as white Alabamians. The voter dilution essentially says, look, your vote is not as important because your vote, if you are in a majority white district, is probably just not going to count very much. And that leaves a lot of people saying, look, why should I even go out to vote if my vote's not going to count? So I want to spend a little time talking about this voter dilution. That's kind of a fancy word of essentially saying that Black Alabamians' vote doesn't count as much as a white Alabamian's vote.
Yeah. One of the things that was discussed is that Alabama is racially polarized voting. And, despite the aberrations that are often pointed to by Republicans, about where an African American may win a majority minority district, it is rare. It is like seeing a unicorn. So, in order to create opportunities for minorities, and again, this is not just Black folks; it's also Hispanics and others, to create an opportunity for Black people, and specifically in this case, to elect someone of our choosing. It requires districts to be drawn in a particular way that increase the Black voting age population to a requisite amount so that we have an opportunity to do so. In Alabama, as you mentioned in your opening, that we're 26, 27% of the population here, but we've only got 14% of the actual congressional delegation. And when you talk about dilution, well, I mean, you're separating us to the point, or you're packing us to the point where you diminish the impact that we could potentially have on electoral politics in the state, which ultimately means that there's a large percentage of the Black population in Alabama that does not have the same opportunity to elect someone of their choosing. And as a matter of fact, as you mentioned, their vote doesn't count as much. And what's odd about this conversation is, my Republican colleagues continue to say that, race shouldn't matter, but clearly it does, to the point where you want to pack us, dilute the impact to minimize our ability to elect someone of our choosing. And then also, I think what needs to really be pointed out is, 27% of the population from 16 to 27 is substantial growth. We all don't live in the same place. So I don't think it's a badge of honor to continue to say to the public that the map looks exactly the same it did from 1993 until 2022. To me, that is almost like admitting that you really don't care about providing opportunities for adequate representation.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point. These maps essentially look exactly the same since 1992, just one out of those 7 districts being
Yeah.
majority Black districts, when we know the Black population has continued to rise in Alabama throughout that time period, that 20-year-ish time period.
Right.
Now, you said something else that I think bears repeating and a little explanation, because we know, and I'm looking at these numbers in front of me, between 26 and 27%, it depends on what kind of survey you look at, of the Alabama electorate is Black. So let's say 27% just for getting rid of fractions. Then 14%, though, that only equates to 14% of the congressional districts in the state. Now, a person who maybe is not as intertwined with the political workings of our system says, well, 14% is not the same thing as 27%. Why is there that discrepancy? Is that normal?
No. I mean, as far as, because again, in most of our map drawing and redistricting, that percentage is taken into account. So you look at our representation in the House and the Senate and on the school board, it's taken into account. It's the math only becomes difficult when we're talking about congressional seats for some reason. So no, it's not. It shouldn't be, and and it should be very easy to draw districts to incorporate the wide diversity that's included in our state to make sure that everybody has an adequate opportunity to elect their person of their choosing. And again, I have to stress this. I keep hearing that this is, the map has been the same for 3 decades. Like, that's something that's a good thing. And like, it's not, because again, not only are we growing in size, in numbers, but we're also moving to different areas of the state. And as one of the things that was presented in the case is that there were several iterations of the map that was drawn that adequately captured the population shifts and the growth that created two districts that will be represented, or had an opportunity to be represented, by an African American. So it wasn't difficult. It's not hard. And to further that point of it not being hard, the Republicans did it in 5 days. So anything that can get to the legislature through a special session in 5 days, either it's magic or it's easy. So it's very disingenuous at this point to turn around and say it's so difficult and it's such a problem, and that we can't get it done again.
And 5 days is a short period of time, as you mentioned. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that timeline you mentioned, because I think that's important. So we know that this all stemmed from a court case where the plaintiff said, this is not fair. Essentially, if you look at this map, and I can pull up a version on my phone here, but if you look at a version of this map, at first glance, you would think that the only Black people in the state lived in that one
Correct.
area. That's what this map appears to look like. And it's kind of towards the southwest part of the state in the Black Belt region. You would look at that and say, well, the whole rest of the state is white except for that one area. So there was a court case that said, look, there needs to be at least one additional majority Black congressional district in the state. Made its way up through the court system. Then we get to a lower court, a federal court, that says, you're right. Alabama needs to redraw these maps. We need to make them more fair. Fast forward to earlier this week, and that was actually had to be done, I believe, by Friday. So that was on a timeline here. And I know you even said that you were trying to get together a cartographer, a special official to oversee the drawings of those maps. Well, then on earlier this week, I believe that was Monday or Tuesday, we have the Supreme Court saying, actually, lower court, you're wrong. Alabama's maps can stand. Now, something I think is important is this was a 5-4 ruling. Chief Justice Roberts joined in with the liberal appointees on the court to say we should have let that lower court ruling stand, make Alabama redraw those maps. But something that I thought was really interesting in the majority opinion, Justices Kavanaugh and Alito said, and I'm looking at my notes to make sure I get this quote right, that this was, quote, not a decision on the merits, end quote. So they were saying, we're not saying Alabama isn't violating the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They're not saying that Alabama is right, but they're letting this trend continue. That is a confusing statement. That's a confusing position for those 5 justices to have.
It is. And I think first thing is, we're saying 5-4. And that's just on paper, the count, because, on paper, Justice Roberts sided with the liberal members of the Supreme Court in saying that, he would have allowed the order to stay. The order to continue and require Alabama to draw new maps. But he was very clear in that he felt like the Supreme Court needed to grant cert and hear arguments about Section 2. So the basis of his decision wasn't necessarily because he thought that Alabama's maps violated the law per se, but that the lower court had enough information, a strong enough record, that their decision was correct on what the law currently is, but later he plans on changing it. So I think the best way to put it is they were correct, but they weren't right. So, and that's what the standard of review is, because again, the record was replete with instances of Alabama's legacy of discriminating against Black voters, and also the numbers and the ability of we have a cartographer here that could draw a map. Now, they gave the state of Alabama the opportunity to do it, but they refused because they felt like they'd rather take their chances in court, and apparently they were correct in that. But I think it's important to note that while they said on several occasions that it wasn't about the merits, Kavanaugh, in the majority opinion, cited Justice Roberts in saying we need to grant cert and have discussions and arguments about Section 2. And if you take that in this appropriate context and look at the entire history of jurisprudence about voting rights under this current court, you kind of get an idea of where this is headed. And, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think, every day I wake up, I think we got a chance, right? But I'm not naive either. And I understand some of the positions that have been taken about voting rights in general and voting rights specifically by this court. And it just gives me pause in thinking that in the next term, there's going to be discussions about Section 2, which is really the only section of the Voting Rights Act that's left now.
That is there's a lot to unpack there, right, Representative? There's a lot to go into this, and a lot of this is really a legal game of volleyball or a legal game of tennis. As you said, correct but not wrong. This is something that gets so into the weeds for I think the majority of Americans and Alabamians that sometimes it's easy for people to say, well, if they are getting into this weedy part of the Voting Rights Act, into this weedy part of the maps, and they must know what they're doing. Yeah. We know that, again, this case is going to be reviewed at a later date. Right now, the justices, I believe Kavanaugh and Alito had said in their opinion that this was too close to redraw those maps to the elections. We know the primaries are coming up here for the midterms in just a few months. So what is next for this lawsuit and for Alabama's maps?
Well, if you read the opinion, they felt like this was such an inconvenience to require Alabama to go back in and draw a new congressional map and then follow the already laid procedure out that, we have elections, there's deadlines and so forth. So because of that, they decided that if we're going to balance the equities here, the inconvenience of having to abide by the order is more important than recognizing the rights of Black Alabamians to elect someone of their choice. To me, that's ridiculous. I think we balance the equities here. Protecting rights is worth whatever minor inconvenience you go through in order to get it right. But so the next steps are, ultimately we'll have elections under what the three panel court said were illegal maps, illegal congressional maps. But on the other hand, there's a chance in the next year or so that a full argument will be heard on the vote dilution claim and the Section 2 arguments and so forth. And the court could ultimately say, you know what, y'all were right, and actually order maps to be redrawn for the next congressional race. So that could be 2 years from now. But it could also take the other stance and further gut the Voting Rights Act. As an argument that's been made that this should be race neutral. I wish they would follow that if that's what they're saying, but it should be race neutral. And ultimately entrench that sort of map drawing for at least another 10 years. So I think that's what we're actually, those are the next steps. And as we mentioned this earlier, I think people really need to go back and pay close attention to what Justice Roberts wrote about vote Section 2 and vote dilution. And again, the standard here wasn't necessarily to determine if we're right or wrong at this level, because again, this is determining if we're saying that you're likely to succeed on the merits of your case, not judging on the merits, but the order will stay it if we don't think you're likely to succeed or not, right? So we're not actually talking about the merits allegedly. We're supposed to be just judging on whether or not this case should go forward. But if you read Justice Roberts' opinion, you can kind of get the impression that, they were talking about the merits, and they're going to have a full discussion on that in the next term.
I want to get your thoughts on a kind of counter argument that I have heard and that has been swirling around social media. And that is the one of many Republicans that say, look, if you want to redraw the maps and draw another map that includes a majority Black district, then aren't you the ones that are gerrymandering? Aren't you the ones that are messing with the maps and trying to maybe not dilute, but trying to change things based on race? Is there not a possibility that there would be a Black Republican who would want to elect a white male Republican to go to the Senate or to Congress?
Yeah. And, that our argument would actually have just a little bit more merit if they actually did racial polarization studies when they drew this map. But they actually didn't even do the basic groundwork when they drew the congressional maps that we're talking about. But I hear that. I mean, I hear that. And, to be honest with you, that argument does not take into account Alabama's legacy of discriminating against Black Alabamians. The Voting Rights Act, in essence, when you balance all the requirements across the board of what it takes to create maps, the Voting Rights Act actually gives you the ability to racially gerrymander if you're trying to right the wrongs of a legacy of discrimination. And also, it gives you that ability if you can follow all the traditional mapping principles, which the plaintiffs in this case did on several occasions with 10 different iterations of maps that comply with all of the requirements, that if you can do it within the confines of the rules that you have, the Voting Rights Act gives you the ability to do it to the extent to make sure that everybody has adequate representation based upon, I guess, in this situation, how we're represented in the population. So, that's in essence why we didn't, we violated the Voting Rights Act, because we ignored all those principles to create districts that diluted Black Alabamians' ability to elect the candidate of our choosing. So, I mean, that's essentially, kind of where we are. So, sure, you say it will require you to racially gerrymander, but that's the Voting Rights Act. There's a reason for it. Again, if you read the record, there are hundreds of years of instances where people's, Black Alabamians were denied the access to voting. Districts were drawn to deny a Black Alabamian's ability to get elected. Racial polarization studies that show that it increases the likelihood of you getting an African American getting elected if the Black voting age population reaches a certain threshold. All these things are facts. All these things have been proven. And so the Voting Rights Act itself was created to help right those wrongs.
That's interesting. And on the flip side there, is it impossible to say that a majority Black district would go Republican and could elect a Republican, a white Republican, even a white Republican man to Congress? Is this saying that automatically, because you create a majority Black district, there will be either a Black representative or a Democrat going to Congress?
Yeah, I mean, one of the words that was used, this is an opportunity district. It allows for the opportunity for someone else to get elected. And you may have a significant Black voting age population, but ultimately it could create a white candidate or a white representative. But on the other hand, we have years and years of history that indicate that we vote in a racially polarized way in Alabama. And the way to cure that and to make sure that African Americans have adequate representation based upon their percentage of the population is to use the tools that were given to us by the Voting Rights Act to right all the wrongs of the history of the state. And again, I think if you read this record and you read this order, which was thousands of pages with several examples of why this is necessary, I think most people could come to that reasonable conclusion.
Representative, there are so many people across the country and across the state that they are just trying to get by, whether that be working from home, dealing with children at home, inflation, gas prices. They're just trying to make ends meet, trying to get their kids off to school or get them started on their virtual school, share the bandwidth of the internet in the house.
Right.
There are so many people who are just kind of unplugged from issues that are, again, as deep and as complicated as voting rights, as complicated as congressional district map drawing. What do you say just kind of overall to people that say, look, why do I care about this? Why do I need to care about this with everything else going on in the world?
Well, honestly, if you're tired of commercials that are designed to manipulate you and to lie to you, that are designed to get you as angry as possible so you don't focus on the issues that matter. So, you got somebody shooting a commercial telling you that we don't teach hate in our classroom, but you don't have healthcare. Or, we're somebody talking about 50 different genders, but you don't have broadband access. Or somebody says that the election was stolen, but, you don't have access to the same opportunity in your classroom because of where you live than in one of your counterparts. If you're unplugged, you're going to get this type of politic and this type of politician. But if you engage and actually hold someone accountable, we stop talking about politics and we start talking about policy and what I can do to actually change your life. So apathy doesn't create good politicians. Apathy actually creates bad politics. So if you want to change your community, if you're tired of a lack of opportunity, if you're tired of struggling to get about healthcare and the many other things that Alabamians we're plagued by right now, well, you have to engage. You have to ignore the rhetoric and actually put people in positions that are addressing real life problems. It's interesting that, for example, we've got in Brookwood thousands of coal miners who've been on strike for almost a year now. And all these terrible commercials you're hearing on TV, you don't see one word about that. We've got hundreds of thousands of Alabamians that need health care. But through all these terrible commercials you're seeing on TV, you don't hear anything about that. We're ranked dead last in education in almost every measurable metric. but most of the people are talking about how much Trump loves me. That's not going to change your life. What's going to change your life is you to get engaged, pay attention, hold folks accountable, and make them talk about real life issues.
Representative England, what are you doing next? What's next? I know you said you're an eternal optimist. How
Yeah.
do you get through this election cycle with these maps? And what are you leading your party? How are you leading your party through this, the Alabama Democratic Party?
Well, first, continuing to try to educate folks to make sure they understand that while a lot of people attempt to capture these things as partisan issues to divide, they're not. These are all American issues. These are all issues that affect Alabamians. So continue to educate folks to make sure that they understand that the process is not about what you see on TV. It's actually what goes on at your kitchen table every night. What discussions that you're having with your family about how to take care of yourself in whatever situation that you're in. So again, we're going to continue to message that and to continue to offer alternatives to the average Alabamians to know that there are people who care about those kitchen table issues. And we're not out here just to try to get elected. We're actually out here trying to make a difference. Now, it's not, and it also doesn't necessarily come with just running for office. It also comes with your advocacy and your passion about the issues that matter to you. So you don't necessarily have to run for office in order to affect change and affect the debate. Just make sure that people understand and know that you're here and that you matter. As far as legislature is concerned, me and my colleagues are going to continue to fight to protect voting rights. We're going to continue to fight to protect, to try to reform the criminal justice system to make it more just and more fair. We're going to continue to fight to make sure that workers who are actually striking, trying to get treated fairly, get that opportunity to do so, and many other issues. So, and you'll see through our legislation and the fights that we get into in the legislature that I know me and my colleagues we have the average Alabamians back here. So that's basically it, and just kind of keep leading by talking about the issues that matter.
Alabama Democratic Party leader and Representative Chris England, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time today to break down this decision and tell us how it really matters and how it really affects Alabamians. We really appreciate your time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody watching. Thank you again, and we will see you tomorrow.